You know that moment when the universe decides to rearrange your entire life while you're just trying to patch a hole? For me, it started with the sound of water dripping onto hardwood floors at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. Not my water, not my floors, but somehow it became my problem the second Mrs. Henderson from next door started banging on my apartment door like the building was on fire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I rolled out of bed, stubbed my toe on a toolbox I'd left by the nightstand, and stumbled to answer what I assumed was going to be another complaint about my late-night guitar playing. Instead, I found a 70-something woman in a pink bathrobe, holding an umbrella indoors. "Marcus, honey, you need to see this," she said, grabbing my arm before I could even say good morning. "Linda's ceiling is about to come down, and she's too proud to call anyone." That's when I looked across the narrow gap between our apartment buildings and saw her. Linda stood in her second-floor window, staring up at a growing water stain on her ceiling with the kind of resigned expression people wear when life decides to test them again. She had auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun, wore an oversized sweater, and held a metal pot in one hand like she was preparing for battle against gravity itself. Mrs. Henderson nudged me forward. "She's been dealing with that leak since the storm last week. Won't ask for help, won't admit she needs it. You're handy, aren't you?" I am Marcus Rivera, 35 years old, and up until 18 months ago, I wore suits that cost more than most people's rent. I used to manage construction projects from climate-controlled offices, moving millions of dollars around spreadsheets while other people got their hands dirty. I had a corner office, a company car, and a stress level that could power a small city. Then my dad had his heart attack. Not fatal, thank God, but serious enough to make me realize I'd been living someone else's definition of success. Dad spent 40 years building things with his hands, teaching me that honest work meant something more than profit margins. After he recovered, I walked away from corporate life and started working with Frank Morrison, a local contractor who believed in fixing things properly instead of quickly. Frank runs his business out of a converted garage that smells like coffee, sawdust, and the kind of wisdom you can only get from decades of solving other people's problems. He's 62, built like a fire hydrant, and has opinions about everything from proper nail placement to why kids today don't understand the value of manual labor. He hired me not because I needed the job, but because he said I looked like someone who was finally ready to learn something useful. The pay cut was substantial. The satisfaction was everything I didn't know I was missing. So when Mrs. Henderson dragged me across the courtyard that Tuesday morning to meet Linda, I was already reaching for my mental toolbox. What I wasn't prepared for was the way she looked at me when she opened her door, like she was expecting me to judge her for needing help. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, stepping back to let us in. Mrs. Henderson insisted, "But really, I can handle this myself." Her apartment was a study in controlled chaos, books stacked on every surface, half-finished art projects spread across a dining table, and in the corner, a bucket positioned strategically under a ceiling stain that looked like a map of some undiscovered continent. The dripping sound echoed through the space with metronomic persistence. "When did this start?" I asked, looking up at the damage. "Thursday night," she admitted. "Right after that big storm. I thought it would stop on its own." I climbed onto a chair to get a closer look. The water stain was larger than it appeared from below, and the ceiling had started to sag in one corner. This wasn't a simple patch job. This was going to require getting up on the roof, finding the source, and probably replacing sections of both the roof and the ceiling. "This is going to be more involved than a quick fix," I told her, climbing down. "You're going to need someone to check the whole roof, not just patch the leak." Linda's shoulders sagged slightly. "How much do you think something like that would cost?" The way she asked told me everything I needed to know about her financial situation. I'd learned to read people during my corporate days, but it was different now. Instead of looking for leverage, I was looking for ways to help. "Let me take a look at the roof first," I said. "Sometimes these things look worse than they are." Mrs. Henderson beamed like she'd just solved world hunger. "I told you he was good people, Linda. Marcus here used to be some big shot in the city, but he came back to do real work." "Mrs. Henderson," I warned, but Linda was already looking at me with new curiosity. You left the city to fix roofs? She asked. Long story, I said. Mind if I grab my ladder from next door? 20 minutes later, I was on Linda's roof, discovering that the problem was indeed worse than it looked from inside. Several shingles had blown off during the storm, leaving the underlayment exposed. Water had been getting in through multiple points, and what looked like a single leak was actually the result of several smaller breaches that had converged into one major problem. I climbed back down to find Linda waiting in her backyard, arms crossed against the morning chill. Well, she asked. It's fixable, I said, but it's going to take a few days. You've got multiple breach points, and some of the underlayment needs to be replaced. She was quiet for a long moment, staring up at her roof like it had personally betrayed her. I should probably get a few estimates, she said finally. Probably, I agreed. But if you want, I can start with the emergency patches today. Stop the water from getting worse while you figure out what you want to do long term. Linda looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Why would you do that? It was a fair question. I was essentially offering to work for free on the promise that she might hire me later. In my old life, that would have been terrible business. But standing in her backyard, watching her try to maintain dignity while her house literally fell apart around her, business wasn't really the point. Because Mrs. Henderson is right, I said. You need help, and I know how to help. She studied my face for what felt like a full minute. Then she smiled, and it transformed her entire expression. Okay, she said. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But I'm making you lunch. That's how I ended up spending my Tuesday afternoon on Linda Morrison's roof, patching holes and trying not to think about how long it had been since someone had offered to make me lunch just because I was being helpful. Frank always said the best jobs were the ones where you felt useful. And as I worked in the autumn sunshine, listening to Linda moving around inside her house, I understood what he meant. Around noon, she called up to me from the backyard. Sandwich? Break? I climbed down to find she'd set up a small table in her garden with sandwiches, chips, and 2 glasses of iced tea. It was the kind of simple gesture that somehow felt more significant than any business lunch I'd ever attended. Turkey and Swiss, she said, gesturing to a plate. I hope that's okay. I'm not much of a cook, but I can handle sandwiches. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, surrounded by her garden. It was clear she spent time out here. The plants were well tended, the small space organized with the kind of attention that spoke to someone who found peace in growing things. Can I ask you something? She said eventually. Sure. Mrs. Henderson said you used to work in the city. What made you give that up? I took a sip of tea, trying to figure out how to explain it without sounding like I was having some kind of midlife crisis. I spent 10 years managing other people's construction projects from behind a desk, making sure things got built on time and under budget, but never actually building anything myself. Then my dad had a heart attack, and I realized I was living someone else's idea of success. Linda nodded slowly. How's your dad now? Good, stubborn as ever. He keeps trying to help Frank with jobs even though he's supposed to be taking it easy. And you're happy? Doing this instead? I looked around her garden, then up at her roof where I'd spent the morning actually solving a real problem with my hands instead of moving numbers around a computer screen. Yeah, I said. I really am. That's brave, she said quietly. Not really. Just took me longer than it should have to figure out what I actually wanted to do. She was quiet for a moment, picking at her sandwich. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. What I want to do. What do you mean? Linda gestured vaguely at her house, her garden, the space around us. Tom and I bought this place 15 years ago. We were going to fix it up together, make it exactly what we wanted. Then he got sick, and all our plans just stopped. This was the first time she'd mentioned Tom, and I could hear the weight of loss in her voice. How long has it been? I asked gently. 2 years in December. She looked up at the roof, then back at me. I keep thinking I should sell it, move somewhere smaller, more practical. But then something breaks, and I think maybe I should just fix it instead. What's stopping you? She laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Fear, mostly. Fear that I don't know how to take care of a place like this on my own. Fear that I'm too old to start over. Fear that I'll mess it up. I finished my sandwich, thinking about what she'd said. You know what Frank told me when I started working for him? What? He said the only difference between a problem and a project is whether you're willing to learn something new. Linda smiled at that. Frank sounds like a wise man. He is. Also incredibly stubborn and prone to lectures about the decline of craftsmanship in America, but wise. We finished lunch, and I went back up on the roof to complete the emergency patches. By the time I climbed down for the day, I'd managed to stop the immediate water infiltration. But the bigger repairs would have to wait. That should hold until... We can do the proper fix, I told her, packing up my tools. How much do I owe you for today? Nothing. This was just diagnostic work. Linda shook her head. I can't let you work for free. You made me lunch. We're even. She looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she said, Will you at least let me get you a proper estimate for the full repair? Of course. But Linda, yeah? Whatever you decide about the house, don't decide based on fear. Decide based on what you actually want. As I walked back across the courtyard to my apartment, I realized I'd given myself the same advice I'd given her. The corporate world I'd left behind felt like someone else's life now, and standing in Linda's garden, talking about projects and possibilities, I felt more like myself than I had in years. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. That helping Linda fix her roof would end up changing both of our lives in ways neither of us could have imagined. But that's a story for tomorrow. Part 2. The Hardware Store Adventure. I should have known Linda wasn't the type to wait around for formal estimates when she showed up at Frank's shop the next morning, carrying a thermos of coffee and a notebook filled with what looked like architectural sketches. Frank was hunched over his workbench, muttering creative profanity at a carburetor that refused to cooperate, when the bell above the door chimed. He looked up, saw Linda, and his entire demeanor shifted from gruff mechanic to something approaching charm. You must be the lady with the roof situation, he said, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. Marcus told me about your place. That old Victorian on Maple Street, right? That's right, Linda said, extending the thermos toward him. I brought coffee, as a thank you for lending me your best worker yesterday. Frank accepted the coffee, with the reverence of a man who'd been drinking his own bitter brew for 40 years. Best worker might be generous, but he's teachable. What can we do for you? Linda opened her notebook and spread it on Frank's workbench. The pages were covered with detailed sketches of her house, measurements, and notes written in neat handwriting. I've been thinking about what Marcus said yesterday, about deciding based on what I want instead of what I'm afraid of. I leaned over to look at her drawings. They weren't just repair plans. She'd sketched out improvements, additions, creative solutions that would transform her house from a problem into a project. I want to fix the roof properly, she continued. But I also want to update the gutters, maybe add some skylights to the upstairs bedrooms, and there's this back porch that Tom and I always talked about building. Frank studied her sketches, with the serious attention he usually reserved for structural engineering problems. This is good work, he said finally. You draw these yourself? I used to be a graphic designer before I got married. Still dabble in it sometimes. Well, you've got a good eye for space. Most of these ideas are solid. He looked up at her. But this is going to be a major project. You talking about a full renovation here? Linda nodded. I know it's ambitious. Maybe crazy. But I keep thinking about what you said, Marcus. About problems versus projects. I want this to be a project. The way she said it, with this mix of determination and vulnerability, reminded me why I'd left the corporate world. Here was someone ready to invest in something real, something that mattered to her personally, instead of just throwing money at a quick fix. All right, Frank said, closing the notebook and handing it back to her. But if we're going to do this, right, we need to start with proper materials. And that means a trip to Morrison's Hardware. Linda's face lit up. Morrison's is still open? I thought that place closed years ago. Old Pete Morrison is too stubborn to retire, Frank said. Plus his grandson Jake took over most of the day-to-day operations. They've got everything we'll need. and Pete knows more about older houses than anyone in 3 counties. That's how I found myself an hour later walking through the aisles of Morrison's Hardware with Linda, both of us following Frank like students on a field trip. The store was exactly what you'd expect from a family business that had been serving the same community for 60 years. Narrow aisles packed floor to ceiling with everything from penny nails to vintage doorknobs, the kind of place where you could find a replacement part for a 1950s washing machine right next to state-of-the-art power tools. Pete Morrison emerged from behind the counter like he'd been expecting us. He was somewhere north of 70, with white hair and the kind of weathered hands that come from a lifetime of handling tools and materials. His grandson Jake appeared, from the back room, younger version of Pete but with the same keen eyes and practical demeanor. "Frank Morrison," Pete said, grinning. "What brings you to my little corner of paradise?" "Got a customer with a Victorian that needs some serious attention," Frank replied, nodding toward Linda. "Thought you might have some wisdom to share." Pete's eyes lit up. "Victorian, you say? Which one?" "The blue one on Maple Street," Linda said. "The one with the tower room and the wraparound porch." "Ah, the Hendricks place," Pete said immediately. "Built in 1892, original slate roof, oak floors throughout, and if I remember correctly, some beautiful original trim work upstairs." Linda stared at him. "How do you possibly know all that?" "Honey, I've been selling materials to fix that house for 30 years. Your husband Tom used to come in here regularly, always had some project or another going on." The mention of Tom brought a moment of silence, but Pete continued gently. "He was a good man. Always said he was going to restore that place to its original glory someday." "That's what I want to do," Linda said quietly. "Finish what we started." Jake stepped forward. "We actually have some original materials in the back that might work for your project. Salvaged slate tiles, period-appropriate hardware, even some original windows that came out of a similar house downtown." For the next 2 hours, we wandered through the store while Pete and Jake pulled materials, explained options, and shared stories about the various houses they'd helped restore over the years. Linda took notes, asked questions, and gradually transformed, from someone seeking basic repairs into someone planning a comprehensive restoration. The turning point came when Jake led us to a section in the back where they kept architectural salvage. Among the reclaimed materials, Linda found a set of original stained glass windows that had come from a house built in the same era as hers. "These are beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the colored glass. "But I'm sure they're expensive." Jake looked at Pete, who shrugged. "Tell you what," Pete said. "Your husband helped me move some heavy equipment a few years back. Wouldn't take any payment. How about we call it even?" Linda's eyes welled up. "I can't accept that." "Sure you can," Pete said. "Besides, Jake here has been looking for the right project to showcase these windows. Your house sounds perfect." As we loaded materials into Frank's truck, Linda grew quiet. I could see her processing everything, probably wondering if she was making a huge mistake or finally doing something right. "Second thoughts?" I asked as we secured a stack of slate tiles. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted. "This is more money than I've spent on anything since Tom died. Part of me thinks I should just patch the roof and call it good." Frank overheard and turned around. "Let me tell you something about houses," he said. "They're like people. You can keep putting band-aids on problems, or you can address the underlying issues and build something stronger. But what if I mess it up? What if I spend all this money and it doesn't turn out the way I imagine? Then you'll have learned something," Frank said. "And you'll still have a better house than when you started." The drive back to Linda's place was quiet, all of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we pulled into her driveway and started unloading materials, something shifted. Linda started talking about where the stained glass windows would go, how the new porch would catch the morning sun, what the house would look like when everything was finished. "The tower room," she said suddenly, pointing up at the small circular room at the top of her house. "Tom always said that would make a perfect art studio. Good light, quiet, separate from the rest of the house." "What kind of art do you do?" I asked. "I used to paint, watercolors mostly. Haven't touched a brush since Tom got sick. But I keep thinking maybe it's time to start again." Frank nodded approvingly. "Every house needs a creative space. Place where you can make something just because you want to." As we stacked materials in Linda's garage, I realized this had become more than a roofing job. We were helping her reclaim not just her house, but her life. The woman who had apologetically asked for help with a leak was now planning a complete restoration, talking about art studios and future projects with growing confidence. "So when do we start?" she asked, as Frank and I prepared to leave. "Monday morning," Frank said. "But fair warning, once we start tearing into that roof, there's no going back. We're going to find more problems, and it's going to get messy before it gets better." Linda looked up at her house, then back at us. "I'm ready for messy." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the change I'd seen in Linda over just 2 days. The tentative woman who couldn't decide whether to fix her leak had become someone planning a major restoration project. It reminded me of my own transformation, how leaving the corporate world had felt impossible until the moment I actually did it. But there was something else happening, something I wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Somewhere between fixing her, emergency patches, and shopping for restoration materials, I'd started thinking about Linda's project as our project, not just as her contractor, but as someone who cared about the outcome beyond the paycheck. That should have been a warning sign. Getting emotionally invested in a client's project was exactly the kind of complication I'd tried to avoid since starting over in Millbrook. But watching Linda rediscover her confidence, seeing her eyes light up when she talked about transforming her house into something beautiful, I found myself wanting to be part of that transformation. Frank had warned me when I first started working, for him, that the best jobs were often the most dangerous ones. Not physically dangerous, but emotionally dangerous. The jobs where you cared too much, where the work became personal, where success felt like more than just completing a project. Standing in Linda's driveway, watching her plan her future with the kind of hope I hadn't seen from her before, I realized I was already in deeper than I'd intended. And for the first time since leaving my old life behind, I wasn't sure that was a bad thing. Monday was going to bring new challenges, new discoveries, and probably new complications. But as I fell asleep that night, I found myself looking forward to all of it in a way that had nothing to do with roofing and everything to do with the woman who was brave enough to turn her biggest problem into her most ambitious project. Part 3. Chaos and Vulnerability. The first sign that Monday was going to be anything but routine came when I arrived at Linda's house to find her sitting on her front porch at 6:30 in the morning, fully dressed and holding a sledgehammer, like she was preparing for battle. "Please tell me you weren't planning to start without us," I said, climbing out of my truck. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, setting the sledgehammer aside. "I kept thinking about everything we're about to tear apart, and I figured if I was going to have a panic attack, I'd rather get it over with before you and Frank arrived." "And did you? Have a panic attack?" She considered this seriously. "More like a controlled anxiety episode. I made a list of everything that could go wrong, then made another list of everything that could go right. The second list was longer." Frank pulled up just as Linda was explaining her dual-list anxiety management system. He emerged from his truck carrying coffee and what looked like military-grade planning documents. "Morning, folks," he said, spreading blueprints across Linda's porch table. "I spent yesterday evening going over the structural requirements for this project. Good news is, your house has excellent bones. Bad news is, we're about to discover exactly how much previous owners have messed with those bones." Linda peered at the blueprints with the expression of someone trying to read hieroglyphics. "Is that my house?" "That's your house as it was originally designed," Frank explained. "And this," he pulled out another set of papers, "is what I think we'll find once we start opening walls and removing roofing." The second set of drawings looked considerably more complex, with notes about probable electrical issues, potential plumbing complications, and something ominously labeled structural mysteries to be determined. "Should I be worried?" Linda asked. "Should be excited," Frank corrected. "Every old house has secrets. Some of them are problems. Some of them are treasures. Won't know which until we start looking." By 8 o'clock, we had scaffolding erected and were ready to begin removing the damaged sections of Linda's roof. The plan was methodical. Strip the compromised shingles, assess the underlayment damage, then work our way down to determine how extensive the repairs needed to be. What we found was both better and worse than expected. The good news was that most of the roof structure was solid. The bad news was that someone, at some point in the house's history, had installed what Frank diplomatically called creative electrical solutions throughout the attic space. Sweet mother of building codes, Frank muttered, staring at a junction box that appeared to be held together with electrical tape and optimism. Who the hell wired this place? A drunk electrician or a very ambitious squirrel? Linda climbed up the ladder to see what had prompted Frank's colorful commentary. Her reaction was less diplomatic. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," she said, staring at the electrical nightmare. "How is this house still standing?" "Pure stubbornness," I said, carefully photographing the wiring situation, and probably a guardian angel with a very twisted sense of humor. This discovery meant our simple roofing project had just become significantly more complicated. We couldn't safely proceed with the restoration without addressing the electrical issues, which meant bringing in Jimmy Rodriguez, the only electrician in town Frank trusted with vintage houses. Jimmy arrived an hour later, took one look at the attic, and started laughing. "Frank, you beautiful bastard," he said. "You always find me the interesting jobs." "Can you fix it?" Linda asked. "Can I fix it?" Jimmy repeated, still chuckling. "Lady, I can fix anything. Question is whether you want to pay for fixing it right or fixing it cheap." "What's the difference?" "Fixing it right means bringing everything up to current code, which means running new wire throughout most of the house. Fixing it cheap means patching the immediate problems and hoping nothing burns down before you sell the place." Linda looked at Frank, then at me, then back at Jimmy. "How much are we talking about for doing it right?" Jimmy spent 20 minutes examining the electrical system, taking measurements and making notes. When he climbed back down, his estimate made Linda sit down heavily on a sawdust-covered chair. "That's more than I budgeted for the entire roofing project," she said quietly. Frank nodded. "These old houses are like onions. Every layer you peel back reveals another layer underneath." "So what do I do?" "That's up to you," Frank said. "We can patch the roof, ignore the electrical for now and hope for the best. Or, we can do this restoration properly, which means accepting that it's going to cost more and take longer than any of us originally planned." Linda was quiet for a long time, staring up at the partially dismantled roof of her house. I could see her weighing options, calculating costs, probably wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, looking at me. "Sure." "When you decided to leave your corporate job, did you know it was the right decision, or did you just hope it was?" The question caught me off guard. Honestly, I was terrified I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But I was more terrified of staying where I was and never finding out what I was capable of. She nodded slowly. "Tom used to say that the only real failure was giving up before you knew what was possible." Smart man. He was. She stood up, brushing sawdust off her jeans. "Jimmy, how long would it take you to rewire the house properly?" 2 weeks, maybe 3 depending on what else we find." "And Frank, if we do the electrical work, does that change your timeline for the rest of the project?" "Actually makes it easier," Frank said. "Jimmy can work on the electrical while we handle the roofing and structural repairs. Might even save us some time in the long run." Linda took a deep breath. "Okay, let's do it right." Jimmy grinned. "I like this lady." "Just promise me something," Linda said, looking at all of us. "When I start panicking about the cost, which I will, remind me that I chose this. Remind me that I decided to stop being afraid." The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Jimmy started mapping out the electrical work while Frank and I continued removing damaged roofing materials. Linda appointed herself the official documenter of the project, photographing everything and keeping detailed notes about what we found and what we planned to do about it. Around noon, we broke for lunch. Linda had prepared sandwiches again, but this time she'd also made a pitcher of lemonade and set up a proper picnic table in her backyard. "I figured if I'm going to be living in a construction zone for the next month, I might as well embrace it," she said, gesturing to the outdoor dining setup. As we ate, Jimmy regaled us with stories of other electrical disasters he'd encountered over the years. The house where every outlet was wired backwards. The Victorian where the previous owner had somehow managed to route electrical wire through the original gas line pipes. The apartment building where the entire electrical system was powered by a series of extension cords running through the basement. Thing about old houses, Jimmy said, finishing his sandwich, is that they've survived this long, despite all the crazy things people have done to them. That's got to count for something. What's the strangest thing you found during a renovation? Linda asked. Jimmy and Frank exchanged looks. Tell her about the Murphy house, Frank said. Oh man, Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair. We were renovating this 1920s Craftsman, tearing out walls to update the kitchen layout. Behind one of the walls we found a complete speakeasy. Bar, mirrors, hidden entrance, the works. Perfectly preserved, like someone had just walked away from it in 1933 and never came back. What did the owners do? Restored it, Frank said. Now it's the centerpiece of their house. Sometimes the surprises are worth more than what you originally planned. Linda looked thoughtful. You think my house has any hidden treasures? Only one way to find out, I said. That afternoon, we got our answer. While Jimmy worked on mapping the electrical system and Frank handled the roof repairs, I started examining the interior walls to determine what structural work might be needed. In the dining room, I noticed that one wall seemed thicker than it should be, with unusual spacing that didn't match the rest of the house. Linda, come look at this, I called. She appeared with her camera and notebook. What did you find? This wall is weird. See how it's deeper than the others? And look at this section of trim work. It doesn't match the rest of the room. Linda studied the wall, then consulted the original blueprints Frank had drawn up. According to these plans, there should be a doorway here. Exactly. Someone walled over a doorway, but they didn't do it properly. They just built a new wall in front of the old one. So there's a space behind there? Probably. Want to find out what's in it? Linda hesitated for about half a second before nodding. Definitely. I carefully cut through the newer drywall, revealing the original doorway underneath. Behind it was a small room, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, that had been completely sealed off. It was dusty and dark, but intact. Linda shined a flashlight into the space, revealing built-in bookshelves, a small desk, and what looked like an original stained glass window that had been hidden when the wall was built. It's a study, she whispered. There was a whole room here, and someone just walled it off. We spent the next hour carefully exploring the hidden room. It was like stepping back in time. Everything was covered in dust, but perfectly preserved. There were even books still on the shelves, and papers on the desk that appeared to be original correspondence from the 1940s. Why would someone seal off a whole room? Linda asked, carefully examining an old photograph she'd found on the desk. Could be lots of reasons, Frank said, joining us to examine the discovery. Sometimes people wanted to simplify the floor plan. Sometimes there were structural issues. Sometimes families just didn't need the space. Or, Jimmy added, emerging from the attic with electrician's tape in his hair, sometimes people had secrets they wanted to keep hidden. Linda was quiet for a long time, standing in the hidden room with her flashlight, taking in every detail. You know what this means? She said finally. What? My house just got bigger. I've been living here for 15 years, and I never knew this room existed. The discovery of the hidden study changed everything. What had started as a simple roof repair had evolved into a complete restoration project. And now, we were talking about historical preservation. Linda was no longer just fixing her house. She was uncovering its history and bringing it back to life. As we cleaned up for the day, Linda stood in the doorway of the hidden room, looking at the space with the expression of someone who had just been given an unexpected gift. Tomorrow, she said, I want to start clearing this room out properly. I want to see what else is hiding in here. And then what? I asked. She smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, it was the smile of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Then I'm going to make it beautiful. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning while I was installing new support beams in Linda's attic. I heard her voice through the floorboards, initially warm and surprised, then gradually becoming tense and defensive. By the time I climbed down from the attic, she was standing in her kitchen holding the phone like it might bite her, staring out the window with an expression I'd never seen before. Everything okay? I asked, wiping sawdust from my hands. That was my son, she said quietly. David. He's driving up from Portland this weekend. The way she said it didn't sound like good news. I didn't know you had a son. We don't exactly stay in close touch. She set the phone down carefully, as if it were made of glass. He heard about the renovation from my sister Karen. Apparently he has concerns about my financial decisions. I'd learned enough about Linda over the past few weeks to recognize the particular brand of hurt that came with family criticism. What kind of concerns? The kind where a 42-year-old man thinks his mother is incapable of making rational decisions about her own house. She moved to the coffee maker, her movements sharp and precise. He wants to discuss my recent impulsive behavior and help me think through the practical implications of what I'm doing. Frank chose that moment to walk through the back door, carrying a box of the reclaimed wood we'd been using to restore the hidden study. He took one look at Linda's face and set the box down carefully. "What's got you looking like you want to burn something down?" he asked. "My son is coming to visit this weekend. He thinks I've lost my mind." Frank nodded knowingly. "Ah, the concerned family member visit. How long since you've seen him?" "Christmas. Before that, Tom's funeral." Linda poured coffee, with the mechanical precision of someone trying to keep their hands busy. "David never approved of this house. Too old, too much work, too impractical. He's been trying to convince me to sell it and move into a condo since Tom died." "And now?" I asked. "Now he thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown, spending Tom's life insurance money on a house that will never be worth what I'm putting into it." She handed me a mug of coffee, her movements still tightly controlled. "Maybe he's right." "You don't believe that," Frank said flatly. "Don't I?" Linda sat down at her kitchen table, suddenly looking exhausted. 3 weeks ago I needed a roof patch. Now I'm rewiring the entire house, restoring a hidden room, and planning renovations that will take months to complete. From the outside, that probably does look insane. I sat down across from her. From the inside, what does it look like? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee. Like I'm finally living in my house instead of just existing in it. Like I'm honoring what Tom and I planned instead of running away from it. She looked up at me. "But what if David's right? What if I'm just avoiding dealing with reality?" "What would reality look like?" Frank asked. "According to David?" "Selling the house, moving somewhere smaller and more manageable. Taking up hobbies appropriate for a widow approaching 50. Book clubs, maybe some volunteer work. Something safe and sensible and completely forgettable." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about the house or the renovation. This was about Linda's right to determine her own future, to take risks, to choose meaning over safety. "When's he arriving?" I asked. "Saturday afternoon. He's staying until Monday." She rubbed her temples. "I should probably clean up the construction mess. Make the place look less like a disaster zone." "No," Frank said firmly. "You should show him exactly what you're building. Let him see the vision, not just the chaos." "He won't understand. David's always been practical. Numbers and logic and long-term planning. He can't see past the cost and the complications." "Then help him see," I suggested. "Show him the hidden study. Explain what you're uncovering. Let him understand why this matters to you." Linda shook her head. "You don't know David. He made up his mind about this house years ago. He's not coming here to understand. He's coming here to convince me to be reasonable." That weekend, I got my first glimpse of family dynamics that made my corporate politics look like a friendly disagreement about lunch plans. David Morrison arrived Saturday afternoon in a silver sedan that looked like it had never seen a speck of dirt. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of professional confidence that I recognized from my former life. He also looked at his mother's house like it was a crime scene. "Mom," he said, embracing Linda stiffly. "The place looks busy." I was on a ladder replacing damaged trim around the front windows when he arrived. Frank was in the backyard working on the new porch foundation. We'd agreed to stay out of the way and let Linda handle the initial conversation, but it was impossible not to overhear. "Come inside," Linda said. "I want to show you what we've discovered." "We?" "The contractors, Marcus and Frank. They've been wonderful. Through the window, I watched David scan the living room, taking in the construction equipment, the plastic sheeting, the controlled chaos of a house in the middle of transformation. "How much is this costing you?" he asked without preamble. David. "I'm serious, Mom. Karen said you've been working on this for weeks. That's not a roof repair. That's a complete renovation." "It evolved," Linda said carefully. "We found some issues that needed to be addressed. Issues that could have been addressed by the next owner, after you sold the place and moved somewhere appropriate." That's when I heard Linda's voice change, becoming cooler and more controlled. "Appropriate for whom?" "For a woman your age, in your situation." "Mom, this house is too big, too old, too expensive to maintain. You're pouring money into a project that's never going to give you a return on investment." "What if I don't want a return on investment? What if I want a home?" The conversation continued in the same vein for the next hour. David presenting logical arguments about property values and maintenance costs, and Linda's future needs. Linda trying to explain about vision and dreams, and finishing what she and Tom had started. Neither of them really listening to the other. By evening, the tension was thick enough to cut with a circular saw. I was packing up my tools when Linda appeared in the doorway of the hidden study, where I'd been installing new electrical outlets. "How's it going?" I asked, though her expression already provided the answer. "About as well as you'd expect. He thinks I'm having a midlife crisis." "Are you?" She considered this seriously. "Maybe. Is that necessarily a bad thing?" "Depends on what you do with it." Linda sat down on the vintage desk chair we'd found in the hidden room, now cleaned and restored to its original condition. "He keeps talking about what Tom would have wanted, like he knew Tom better than I did." "What would Tom have wanted?" "For me to be happy. For me to live fully instead of just safely." She looked around the study, with its restored built-in shelves and newly revealed stained glass window. "Tom would have loved this room. He would have spent hours in here, reading and planning projects and dreaming about what we could do next." "Have you told David that?" "I've tried, but he doesn't want to hear about dreams. He wants to hear about practical decisions and financial security." She sighed. "Maybe that's my fault. Maybe I raised him to be too practical." The confrontation came Sunday morning over breakfast. I was working on the roof, replacing the last of the damaged shingles, when I heard voices rising from the kitchen below. Not quite shouting, but getting close. "This is insane, Mom. You're 50 years old, living alone in a house that's falling apart, spending money you can't afford on renovations that will never pay for themselves." "I'm 49, Linda said icily. "And this house is not falling apart. It's being restored. By strangers who are probably overcharging you for work you don't need." That's when Frank's voice joined the conversation, and I knew things were about to get interesting. "Son, I'm going to stop you right there." I couldn't see what was happening, but I could imagine Frank's expression. The same look he got when someone suggested cutting corners on a structural repair. "I don't know who you are," David said, "but this is a family matter. I'm the contractor your mother hired to restore this house. And I'm also someone who's watched her make thoughtful, informed decisions about every aspect of this project." Thoughtful? She's gutting a house that she should be selling. She's uncovering the house she and her husband always planned to create together. There's a difference. The argument escalated from there. David questioning our qualifications, our estimates, our motives. Frank defending not just our work, but Linda's right to choose her own path. Linda trying to mediate while clearly struggling not to explode. Finally, I heard her voice cut through the argument, sharp and final. "Enough." The kitchen went quiet. "David, I love you, but I need you to stop talking and start listening." I climbed down from the roof and positioned myself where I could see through the kitchen window. Linda stood at the head of the table, hands flat on the surface, facing her son with an expression of absolute determination. "For 2 years, I've been living in this house like a guest, afraid to change anything, afraid to make plans, afraid to invest in a future because I didn't know if I deserved one without your father." David started to speak, but Linda held up a hand. "I'm not finished. 3 weeks ago, when my roof started leaking, I had a choice. I could patch it and keep living like a guest, or I could fix it properly and start living like someone who belongs here. I chose to belong here. Mom, I'm not having a breakdown, David. I'm having a breakthrough. I'm remembering that I'm allowed to want things, to build things, to invest in my own future, even if that future doesn't make sense to anyone else. She moved to the window, looking out at the garden where Frank was installing new porch supports. Your father and I bought this house because we saw its potential. We made plans and dreamed about what we could create together. When he got sick, those dreams got put on hold. When he died, I thought they died with him. Linda turned back to David, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But they didn't die. They were just waiting. And now I'm finally strong enough to make them real. David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. I just don't want you to get hurt. Financially, emotionally, I don't want you to regret this. The only thing I regret is waiting so long to start. They talked for another hour, not arguing this time, but actually communicating. David still had concerns about the cost and the scope of the project, but he was finally listening to why it mattered to her. Linda acknowledged his worries while standing firm in her decisions. By the time David left Monday morning, they hadn't solved everything, but they'd reached something that looked like understanding. I still think you're crazy, he told her as he loaded his suitcase into his car. I am crazy, Linda agreed. But I'm crazy in the right direction this time. After David drove away, Linda stood in her driveway for a long time, looking up at her house with its partially completed roof and scaffolding-wrapped porch. You okay? I asked, joining her. I'm better than okay, she said. I'm proud of myself. I stood up for what I want, and I didn't apologize for it. Good for you. Marcus, can I ask you something? Sure. When David said I was 50 years old and living alone and maybe making bad decisions, for just a second, I wondered if he was right. If maybe I am too old to be taking risks like this. I looked at her, this woman who had transformed from someone apologetically asking for help to someone confidently defending her dreams. Linda, you're 49 years old, not 90. You're not too old for anything. And taking risks is exactly what you should be doing. She smiled, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to your eyes. That's what I thought. I just needed to hear someone else say it. As we walked back toward the house, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. Linda wasn't just renovating her house anymore. She was renovating her entire relationship with herself, and watching her stand up to her son's doubts, defend her choices, and claim her right to build the life she wanted. I found myself more impressed with her than ever. The completion ceremony wasn't planned. It just happened organically on a crisp October morning when Frank installed the last piece of trim around Linda's newly restored front porch and stepped back to admire 6 weeks of work. Well, I'll be damned, he said, pulling off his work gloves. It's actually finished. I was securing the final slate tile on the tower room roof when I heard him. From up there, I could see the entire transformation spread out below me. The house that had started as Linda's emergency roof repair had become something completely different, something spectacular. The new roof gleamed in the morning sunlight, a perfect blend of restored original materials and carefully selected replacements. The wraparound porch that Tom and Linda had always dreamed about stretched across the front of the house, complete with period-appropriate railings and the kind of architectural details that made you want to sit there with coffee and watch the world go by. But the real transformation wasn't visible from the roof. It was inside, in the restored hidden study where Linda had set up her art studio, painting again for the first time in 3 years. It was in the way she moved through her house now, with the confidence of someone who belonged there completely. I climbed down to find Linda standing in her front yard, hands on her hips, staring at her house with an expression of pure satisfaction. So, I said, joining her, how does it feel to live in the most beautiful house in Millbrook? Like I finally came home, she said. After living here for 15 years, I finally came home. Frank emerged from the porch, carrying his toolbox and wearing the slightly melancholy expression he always got when finishing a project he'd truly enjoyed. Jimmy finished the final electrical inspection yesterday, he said. Pete Morrison delivered the last of the custom hardware this morning. Far as I can tell, we're officially done. Done, Linda repeated, like she was testing the word. I'm not sure I know what to do with done. Start living, Frank said simply. That's what houses are for. That's when Jenny Martinez appeared. From across the street, followed by Mrs. Henderson, Pete Morrison, and what looked like half the neighborhood. Someone had apparently decided that the completion of Linda's restoration project warranted an impromptu celebration. "We brought champagne," Jenny announced, holding up a bottle. "And Mrs. Henderson made her famous apple cake." "Famous is generous," Mrs. Henderson said, but she was beaming. "I just wanted to see the finished product. This old house hasn't looked this good since I was a girl." For the next hour, Linda's front yard filled with neighbors, friends, and what felt like everyone who had contributed to the project in some way. Jimmy showed up with his wife and kids. Jake Morrison brought his camera to document the restoration for the hardware store's project portfolio. Even David surprised everyone by driving up from Portland, carrying flowers and wearing an expression that was equal parts pride and sheepishness. "Mom," he said, embracing Linda, "it's beautiful. I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything," Linda said, "but I'm glad you're here to see it." As the impromptu celebration continued around us, I found myself standing slightly apart, watching Linda in her element. She moved through the crowd with grace and confidence, showing off the restored stained glass windows, explaining the historical significance of the hidden study, laughing at Frank's stories about the electrical disasters we'd discovered and solved. This was the woman who had been hiding under all that grief and uncertainty. This was who she'd been before loss convinced her to play it safe. "You did good work," David said, appearing beside me. "Your mother did the work. We just provided the tools." He nodded, watching Linda explain the provenance of the reclaimed wood to a group of fascinated neighbors. "She's different, stronger, more like she used to be before Dad got sick." "She was always strong. She just forgot for a while." "Thank you," David said, "for helping her remember." As the afternoon wore on and the celebration began to wind down, Linda found me on the front porch steps, where I was sitting with a beer and watching the sunset paint her house in golden light. "Can I ask you something?" she said, settling beside me. "Always. What happens now? I mean, the project is finished, the house is restored, I'm officially living my dream. What comes next?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, partly because I wasn't sure of the answer, and partly because I suspected the answer was going to be complicated. "What do you want to come next?" Linda was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the neighbors say their goodbyes. "I want to keep building things. Not necessarily houses, but projects, dreams, connections." She turned to look at me directly. "Marcus, I need to tell you something." My heart rate picked up slightly. "Okay. 6 weeks ago, when you fixed my emergency roof patches, I was just trying to survive. Trying to get through each day without falling apart completely. I wasn't living. I was just existing. And now? Now I'm living. Really living. For the first time since Tom died. I'm excited about the future, instead of afraid of it." She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "I know this might be presumptuous, and I know our relationship has been professional. But I have to ask. Would you consider taking a chance on a 49-year-old widow who's finally figured out what she wants?" The question hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable, and completely unexpected. Well, not completely unexpected. The connection between us had been building for weeks, but I'd been carefully not thinking about it, telling myself it was just the satisfaction of meaningful work and a challenging project. "Linda," I said carefully, "I know it's complicated. I know we've been working together, and that changes things. I know I'm probably too old for you and too much trouble, and that you have your own life to figure out. Linda, but I also know that you make me laugh, and you believe in my dreams, and when you look at me, I feel like the person I want to be instead of the person I've been afraid to be." "Are you done?" I asked gently. She nodded, looking like she wanted to disappear into the porch floorboards. "Good. Because first of all, you're not too old for me. You're not too much trouble. And my life has been a lot more figured out since I started working on your roof." Her expression shifted from mortification to cautious hope. "Second," I continued, "I've been thinking about the same thing for weeks, but I didn't want to complicate the project or make you feel pressured or cross any professional boundaries. And third? Third, Yes. Absolutely yes. I would love to take a chance on a 49-year-old widow who restores houses and paints watercolors and isn't afraid to dream big. Linda's smile started small and grew until it transformed her entire face. Really? Really. But I have one condition. What? The next project we work on together, we plan as partners from the beginning. No more emergency repairs turning into major renovations without proper consultation. She laughed, the sound bright and free. Deal. Though I should warn you, I've been looking at the garage. I think it has potential as a workshop. Of course, you have. As the sun set behind Linda's beautifully restored house, we sat on her new porch and talked about the future. Not just the immediate future of dating and figuring out how to navigate a relationship that had grown out of a professional partnership, but the longer-term future of building something together. You know what the best part of this whole project was? Linda asked as the first stars appeared. The hidden study? No. The electrical nightmare that nearly tripled your budget? Definitely not. What then? Learning that I'm capable of more than I thought. That I can take risks and make big decisions and trust my own judgment, even when other people think I'm crazy. You were never crazy. Brave, maybe, but not crazy. Brave, she repeated thoughtfully. I like that better. Frank appeared from inside the house where he'd been packing up the last of his tools. Well, folks, I'm heading home. Marcus, see you bright and early Monday morning. We've got the Henderson kitchen renovation starting next week. Actually, Frank, I said, I was thinking maybe it's time I started taking on some projects independently. Maybe partnering with you instead of just working for you. Frank grinned. About time. I was wondering when you'd figure out you were ready to be your own boss again. After Frank left, Linda and I stayed on the porch until well past midnight, talking about everything and nothing, planning projects and sharing stories and figuring out how to turn whatever this was between us into something real and lasting. Thank you, Linda said finally, as we reluctantly prepared to go inside. For what? For seeing possibilities instead of problems. For helping me remember who I am when I'm not afraid. Thank you for letting me help. For trusting me with your dreams. As I walked back to my apartment that night, I thought about the conversation I'd had with my father after his heart attack, about the difference between existing and living, between safety and meaning. 6 weeks ago, I'd been building a new life based on honest work and personal satisfaction. Tonight, I was building something even better. A future shared with someone who understood that the best projects are the ones that change you in the process. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.